And here we are, part 2 of chapter 12. Let's continue. The strange exultation that so often seems to accompany hard fighting came upon me. I knew that both I and Weena were lost, but I determined to make the Morlocks pay for their meat. I stood with my back to a tree, swinging the iron bar before me. The whole wood was full of the stir and cries of them. A minute passed. Their voices seemed to rise to a higher pitch of excitement, and their movements grew faster. Yet none came within reach. I stood, glaring at the blackness. Then suddenly came hope. What if the Morlocks were afraid? And close on the heels of that came a strange thing. The darkness seemed to grow luminous. Very dimly, I began to see the Morlocks about me. 3 battered at my feet, and then I recognized, with incredulous surprise, that the others were running in an incessant stream, as it seemed, from behind me and away through the wood in front. And their backs seemed no longer white, but reddish. As I stood agape, I saw a little red spark go drifting across a gap of starlight between the branches and vanish. And at that I understood the smell of burning wood, the slumberous murmur that was growing now into a gusty roar, the red glow, and the Morlock's flight. Stepping out from behind my tree and looking back, I saw, through the black pillars of the nearer trees, the flames of the burning forest. It was my first fire coming after me. With that, I looked for Weena, but she was gone. The hissing and crackling behind me, the explosive thud as each fresh tree burst into flame, left little time for reflection. My iron bar still gripped, I followed in the Morlock's path. It was a close race. Once the flames crept forward so swiftly on my right as I ran that I was outflanked and had to strike off to the left. But at last I emerged upon a small open space, and as I did so, a Morlock came blundering towards me and past me, and went on, straight into the fire. So at this point, while all seems lost, in fact, the narrator says, I knew that both I and Weena were lost, but I'm going to make them pay for their meat. So he's kind of like, I'm going to go down fighting. But then the fire that he had set with the firewood, it's apparently caught fire in all the woods, and actually this forest fire, even though it's dangerous and everybody has to run from it, it saves him for the moment because now the Morlocks are worried about this forest fire and not so much about the time traveler. But it's really, really sad because we see that he says, I looked for Weena, but she was gone. So at this point, we don't really know what happened to Weena. We can only speculate. Let's see if we learn something as we go on. And now I was to see the most weird and horrible thing, I think, of all that I beheld in that future age. This whole space was as bright as day with the reflection of the fire. In the center was a hillock or tumulus, surmounted by a scorched hawthorn. Beyond this was another arm of the burning forest, with yellow tongues already writhing from it, completely encircling the space with a fence of fire. Upon the hillside were some 30 or 40 Morlocks, dazzled by the light and heat, and blundering hither and thither against each other in their bewilderment. At first I did not realize their blindness, and struck furiously at them with my bar, in a frenzy of fear as they approached me, killing one and crippling several more. But when I had watched the gestures of one of them groping under the hawthorn against the red sky, I heard their moans. I was assured of their absolute helplessness and misery in the glare, and I struck no more of them. So it seems that all these Morlocks are kind of getting together and they're all burning, and because they didn't understand the fire and they didn't really understand how dangerous it was. Yet every now and then, one would come straight towards me, setting loose a quivering horror that made me quick to elude him. At one time, the flames died down somewhat, and I feared the foul creatures would presently be able to see me. I was thinking of beginning the fight by killing some of them before this should happen, but the fire burst out again brightly, and I stayed my hand. I walked about the hill among them and avoided them, looking for some trace of Weena, but Weena was gone. At last I sat down on the summit of the hillock, and watched this strange, incredible company of blind things groping to and fro, making uncanny noises to each one as the glare of the fire beat on them. The coiling uprush of smoke streamed across the sky, and through the rare tatters of that red canopy, remote as though they belonged to another universe, shone the little stars. 2 or 3 Morlocks came blundering into me, and I drove them off with blows of my fists, trembling as I did so. So you can just see all the chaos that these Morlocks are in, because it's so bright with the fire, and it's burning them, and it's smoky and stuff. But because of the brightness of the fire, they're blind, he describes them that. They can't even see, and that's why some of them actually end up running into him. For the most part of that night, I was persuaded it was a nightmare. I bit myself and screamed in a passionate desire to awake. I beat the ground with my hands and got up and sat down again and wandered here and there and again sat down. Then I would fall to rubbing my eyes and calling upon God to let me awake. Thrice I saw Morlocks put their heads down in a kind of agony and rush into the flames. But at last, above the subsiding red of the fire, above the streaming masses of black smoke and whitening and blackening tree stumps, and the diminishing numbers of these dim creatures, came the white light of day. I searched again for traces of Weena, but there were none. It was plain that they had left her poor little body in the forest. I cannot describe how it relieved me to think that it had escaped the awful fate to which it seemed destined. As I thought of that, I was almost moved to begin a massacre of the helpless abominations about me, but I contained myself. The hillock, as I have said, was a kind of island in the forest. From its summit I could now make out through a haze of smoke the palace of green porcelain, and from that I could get my bearings for the White Sphinx. And so, leaving the remnant of these damned souls still going hither and thither and moaning as the day drew clear, I tied some grass about my feet and limped on across the smoking ashes and among black stems that still pulsated internally with fire, towards the hiding place of the time machine. I walked slowly, for I was almost exhausted, as well as lame, and I felt the intensate wretchedness for the horrible death of little Weena. It seemed an overwhelming calamity. Now in this old familiar room, it is more like the sorrow of a dream than an actual loss. But that morning, it left me absolutely lonely again, terribly alone. I began to think of this house of mine, of this fireside, of some of you, and with such thought came a longing that was pain. But as I walked over the smoking ashes under the bright morning sky, I made a discovery. In my trouser pocket were still some loose matches. The box must have leaked before it was lost. So at the end here, we realize that Weena is gone. The Morlocks actually didn't take her. And while she's not eaten by the Morlocks, at this point we got to think that poor Weena perished in the fire. And it makes him feel not just, bad and stuff for obvious reasons, but very, very alone at this point. So you got to be thinking, and this is probably something we're going to discuss too, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Weena is only in this story for, a few chapters, and she doesn't really say much. She speaks a different language, and she's more like a child than anything. But you got to be thinking about what was the author's purpose of Weena, especially since she died a horrible death this way. That's it for chapter 12. Hope you've been enjoying it so far, and look forward to seeing what you think and what you have to say about it. Take care.